In 1963, inside a locked engineering bay deep in Pontiac's Michigan testing facility, a V8 engine was spinning past 6,000 RPM on a dyno stand that technically wasn't supposed to exist. The lights were dim. The doors were supposed to be sealed. And the paperwork on the desk in front of it didn't even officially approve the test. But the engine didn't care. It roared like it was alive. The sound wasn't just loud. It was violent. The kind of noise that rattled your ribcage even through concrete walls. The kind that made junior engineers step back instinctively, like they were watching something dangerous being born. Paint cans on nearby shelves vibrated in rhythm with the camshaft. The floor itself seemed to pulse with each combustion cycle. Outside the bay, a security guard made his rounds, clipboard in hand. He paused near the door, heard the muffled thunder from within, glanced at his watch, and kept walking. He'd learned not to ask questions about what happened in that particular room after midnight. And according to one engineer standing in the corner, wiping oil from his hands with a rag that had seen better days, it sounded like trouble. Because what Pontiac had just built wasn't just another big block V8. It was the 421 Super Duty, and GM didn't just want to keep it secret. They wanted it erased from history. Most people have no idea this engine ever existed. And if you think American muscle cars were born in public, out in the open, celebrated on billboards and showroom floors with champagne and press releases, you're about to find out how wrong that really is. Because this wasn't a story about marketing, this was a story about control and power so extreme, even General Motors got scared of what it had created. Back in the early 1960s, America was in a horsepower war. Pontiac had already started pushing boundaries with the 389 V8, the engine that powered the GTO's early DNA. But inside GM's walls, there was pressure, constant pressure, to hold things back. Insurance companies were already warning about high-performance cars. They'd started collecting data on accident rates. Teenage drivers wrapping Impalas around telephone poles, drag racers losing control on public streets. Every incident was another data point, another reason to raise premiums, another letter sent to Detroit asking what the hell they were thinking. Corporate executives were worried about lawsuits, worried about regulation, worried about senators in Washington who were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about vehicle safety. And GM had an unofficial rule taking shape behind closed doors. No more factory racing programs. But Pontiac didn't listen. Because engineers like Malcolm McKellar and the racing division weren't building engines for boardroom approval. They were building them for Daytona, for drag strips, for the kind of speed that made stock cars feel illegal even when they weren't. These weren't corporate yes men. These were gearheads who happened to have engineering degrees. Men who grew up rebuilding carburetors in their garages and dreaming about Indianapolis. Men who saw horsepower not as a number on a spec sheet, but as a religion. McKellar himself was known for walking the factory floor at odd hours, checking tolerances by hand, arguing with machinists about thousandths of an inch that nobody else cared about. He'd measure valve springs with a micrometer, feel the tension, and reject entire batches if something felt wrong. Not measured wrong, felt wrong. He didn't just want a fast engine. He wanted something that would make people question what was possible. Something that would make Ford engineers lose sleep at night. And that's where the 421 Super Duty began. It started as a simple idea: take the already massive 389 architecture and push it far beyond what it was designed to handle. They increased the bore to 4.09 inches and stretched the stroke to 4.00 inches, creating 421.2 cubic inches of raw American iron. On paper, it looked like just another displacement bump, another entry in the spec book, but in reality, it was a complete redesign of stress tolerance inside the block. Forged steel crankshaft. Not cast. Forged. The difference in cost was enormous. The difference in strength was the difference between surviving a race and scattering parts across 3 lanes of asphalt. Heavy-duty connecting rods. Reinforced cylinder walls that were pushed so thin in places, engineers reportedly joked you could almost read through them under the right light. The block itself was hand-selected. Not every casting made the cut. Foundry workers would tap the blocks with hammers, listening for inconsistencies in the ring. If it didn't sound right, if there was even the slightest variation in tone that suggested a void or weakness in the casting, it didn't get machined. No exceptions, no second chances. Compression ratios climbed as high as 11.5 to 1 in race trim. Some whispered variants pushed even higher, 12 to 1, maybe more. Nobody would confirm it officially, but the dyno numbers didn't lie. Fuel? High-octane race gas only. Anything less, and the engine would detonate itself apart before finishing a lap. The pre-ignition would sound like marbles in a blender, and then suddenly, silence, followed by the unmistakable smell of burned piston rings and shattered dreams. The pistons were forged aluminum, not cast, each one machined to tolerances that seemed obsessive to outside observers. But the engineers knew better. At 6,500 revolutions per minute, obsessive tolerances became survival requirements. And then came the real weapon, the Super Duty package. This wasn't a single engine. It was a philosophy, hand-built components, reinforced oiling systems, beefed-up cooling passages, and in some versions, the legendary tri-power setup, 3 Rochester 2-barrel carburetors feeding the beast like a storm system. Each carburetor was tuned individually. The center carb handled idle and cruising. The outboards kicked in under heavy throttle, dumping fuel and air into the cylinders like a dam breaking open. When all 3 were wide open, the intake roar alone could drown out the exhaust. It sounded like the engine was inhaling the atmosphere. Street versions made around 410 to 425 horsepower depending on tune. But the racing versions? Those were whispered to be pushing 500 horsepower, maybe more. And Pontiac never officially confirmed it. The official rating would say 405 horsepower, maybe 421 on a good day, matching the displacement for marketing poetry. But everyone in the racing community knew those numbers were fiction. Comfortable fiction designed to keep insurance companies calm and GM executives ignorant. But the dyno sheets told a different story. One engineer reportedly said, "It didn't feel like an engine. It felt like it was trying to escape the test stand." The dyno operator had to recalibrate the equipment twice because he thought the numbers were wrong. They weren't wrong. The engine was just that violent. The torque curve looked like a cliff face. The horsepower peak seemed to keep climbing even past the point where the graph paper ran out. And that was the problem. Because GM executives weren't blind. They knew exactly what Pontiac was building. And they didn't approve. The order came down from the top. General Motors would officially ban factory-backed racing in 1963. No more direct support. No more engineering loopholes. No more Super Duty programs. The decision was made in a conference room in Detroit. Executives in suits who'd never turned a wrench in their lives, deciding the fate of engines they'd never heard run. Men who drove Cadillacs with automatic transmissions and thought 0 to 60 in 12 seconds was adequate performance. On paper, it looked clean. A simple corporate policy adjustment. A realignment of brand priorities, a strategic pivot towards safety and reliability. In reality, it was a shutdown order, but Pontiac didn't stop. They just got quieter. Very, very quiet. Engines continued to be built in small numbers. Not advertised. Not promoted. Not even documented in normal production logs the way they should have been. Some were shipped directly to racing teams with invoices that listed them as replacement components or service parts. Others went into experimental fleets that somehow always ended up on a track. The paperwork would say special order or fleet vehicle. Nothing about horsepower. Nothing about racing. Nothing that could trace back to corporate if things went wrong. And things were definitely going to go wrong. Parts were shipped in unmarked crates. Invoices were deliberately vague. One shipment was reportedly labeled as agricultural equipment components, despite containing a fully built 4-2-1 Super Duty short block. And that's when things started breaking violently. At Daytona, private Pontiac-backed teams began showing up with lightweight Catalina and Grand Prix bodies stuffed with 421 Super Duty engines. The cars looked stock from a distance. Same body lines, same trim, same exterior appearance. But when the green flag dropped, everything changed. A 1962 Catalina, fitted with a SD 421, reportedly hit over 150 miles per hour on the banking. Something stock suspension was never designed to survive. The car didn't just go fast, it became unstable. The front end would lift at high speed, reducing steering input to a vague suggestion rather than a command. The rear tires would break loose mid-corner even on the banking. Drivers described it as riding a missile that was still deciding where it wanted to go. One pit crew member remembered it clearly. It wasn't just fast, it was unstable. like the car was arguing with physics. They added weight to the front, lead plates bolted under the bumper, sandbags in the footwell during practice runs. They stiffened the springs, changed the shocks 3 times in one weekend trying to get it planted. And still, it wanted to fly. The aerodynamics were all wrong for the speed the engine was capable of producing. The car was designed to look good in a showroom, not cheat wind resistance at 155 miles per hour. And then the failures started. Bearings would disintegrate after extended high RPM runs. Oil temperatures would spike past safe limits within minutes. Some engines came back from races with metal flakes in the oil pan so thick mechanics described it as glitter made of destruction. One team drained the oil after a 200-mile run, and the filter was completely black, solid, like it had been dipped in tar. When they cut it open with a hacksaw to inspect it, the filter media had collapsed entirely under the pressure and contamination. Mechanic Charlie Harrell once looked at a torn-down SD engine and said, "The crank doesn't fail, it surrenders." He was holding a bearing that had literally turned into powder inside the journal. The surface was gone. The Babbitt material had simply vaporized under heat and friction. Just dust and the memory of what used to be precision engineering. But Pontiac engineers knew exactly why. At sustained 6,000 plus RPM, the oiling system was starving the rear main bearings. The design still carried traces of street engine thinking. And race conditions didn't care about street logic. The oil pump could move volume, but not fast enough under sustained load. By the time oil reached the rear main, pressure had dropped just enough to let metal touch metal. And at those speeds, metal doesn't touch. It welds, then explodes. So they modified it, drilled passages, improved oil routing, reinforced mains, anything to keep the crank alive under full load. They added oil restrictors in some passages to force more flow to the critical areas. They ran higher viscosity oils that could handle the heat. Some teams experimented with 60-weight racing oil that was nearly solid at room temperature. They even experimented with external oil coolers, mounted low in the chassis, where air could hit them at speed. Because if this engine could survive, it would dominate. But GM's pressure wasn't stopping either. And then came the real nightmare. Insurance companies started noticing Pontiac's speed numbers. NASCAR officials started tightening rules, measuring engine components with increasing paranoia. And GM executives began quietly pulling funding from anything labeled high performance. It wasn't just a technical battle anymore. It was political, and Pontiac was losing ground. Internal memos started circulating. Words like liability and brand risk showed up more than horsepower or victory. Accountants were now sitting in on engineering meetings, asking uncomfortable questions about cost versus benefit. Lawyers were reviewing press releases before they went out, removing any language that could be used against them in court. The culture was shifting, and not in favor of the engineers, but not in the way anyone expected. Because in 1963, something happened that changed everything. At Daytona, a heavily modified Pontiac Catalina, powered by a 421 Super Duty, lined up against Ford's growing big block program. Ford had brought their best, factory-backed in everything but name, engineers in the pits wearing unmarked shirts, parts shipped in crates with falsified manifests. The race was brutal. High temperatures, high speeds, engines running at the edge of survival. The heat was so intense that drivers were rotating out every 50 laps just to avoid heat exhaustion. Cockpit temps hit 130 degrees. Steering wheels were too hot to grip without gloves. One driver had blisters on his palms after a stint and refused to admit it until the race was over. Lap after lap, the Pontiac held pace. Then it started pulling away. Not slowly, not gradually. It just stretched the gap like the other cars were standing still. By lap 47, one of Ford's leading entries suffered catastrophic valve failure. A valve spring broke, the valve dropped into the cylinder, and the piston turned it into shrapnel. Oil sprayed across turn 3. The car coasted to the apron, trailing smoke like a signal flare. Another car dropped out with overheating issues. The temperature gauge had been pinned in the red for 20 laps before the head gasket finally surrendered. Meanwhile, the Pontiac SD just kept going. Lap 50, lap 75. Lap 100, the temperature gauge stayed pegged near the red line but never crossed it. The oil pressure held steady at 60 pounds per square inch. The engine never missed a beat, never coughed, never hesitated. It just ran. But there was a problem. It was winning too loudly. GM executives were watching, not cheering, not celebrating. Watching, because every victory made the engine more dangerous in their eyes. One internal memo reportedly described it as an uncontrollable escalation of performance branding risk. In other words, the engine was too good, and that made it a liability. Because if Pontiac could build this, what would Ford build next? What would Chrysler do? Where did it end? When would some kid wrap one of these things around a school bus and trigger federal regulation that would strangle the entire industry? It didn't end, it escalated. And GM wanted out before someone got hurt, before lawsuits piled up, before Congress started asking questions about why cars were being built to go 160 miles per hour on public roads where the speed limit was 65. So the decision came down hard. Phase out Super Duty production. End factory support. Erase internal documentation. Let it fade. The order was clear and unambiguous. Any engineer caught working on Super Duty development after the deadline would face immediate reassignment. Maybe worse. But you can't erase an engine like that, because racers don't forget, and neither do engineers. The final evolution of the 421 Super Duty wasn't just about power anymore. It was about survival. Teams pushed them harder. Higher compression, leaner fuel mixtures, more aggressive cam profiles that made idle nearly impossible without shaking the car apart. Some engines idled so rough they'd stall at red lights. Others had such aggressive timing curves they'd backfire through the carburetors on deceleration, spitting flames out of the air cleaner like a dragon clearing its throat. They weren't street engines anymore. They were science experiments with VIN numbers. In one endurance setup, a SD421-powered Pontiac reportedly ran nearly 500 miles at sustained high speed without shutting down. Average speed hovered near 120 miles per hour. Fuel stops every 90 minutes. Driver changes every 2 hours, but the engine never stopped, never cooled down, just kept running at temperatures that would have killed lesser power plants in the first hour. That kind of endurance wasn't normal. It was borderline impossible for the era. Modern engines with computer controls and synthetic oil still struggle with that kind of sustained abuse. This was carbureted iron running on 1960s metallurgy and hope. And yet it happened. At the same time, Ford and Chrysler were escalating their own programs. The Hemi 5.8 was making headlines with brute torque that could twist drive shafts into pretzels. Ford's FE series was improving rapidly, adding displacement and aggression with each iteration. The horsepower war was no longer regional. It was national. But Pontiac had something different. Not just power, refinement under pressure. The Super Duty didn't just make power. It made power reliably, repeatably. It could run full throttle for extended periods without scattering itself across the infield. And that's what made GM nervous. Because the 421 Super Duty wasn't just fast in a straight line. It survived where others failed. Still, the writing was on the wall. By the mid-1960s, corporate GM policy had fully shifted. Racing involvement was officially gone. Engine development was redirected toward reliability and passenger comfort. The raw, aggressive engineering culture that built the SD421 was being dismantled piece by piece. Engineers were reassigned to truck divisions, emissions departments, comfort and luxury programs. Projects were canceled mid-development, parts still on order, prototypes half-assembled on engine stands. Dyno rooms that once ran 24 hours a day went quiet. Factories that once whispered about horsepower were now talking about emissions and warranties. And the Super Duty program quietly disappeared. Tooling was shelved in warehouses where it gathered dust for decades. Parts were phased out of catalogs. Documentation was buried in archives most engineers never accessed again. Some files were simply destroyed. Some of the original test engines were reportedly scrapped, melted down for raw material. Others vanished into private collections, their histories erased from official records, their VIN numbers filed off or altered. But the legend didn't stay buried, because the people who drove those cars, they remembered what it felt like. One former driver said, "It didn't accelerate. It launched you forward like the world gave up trying to hold you back." Another mechanic simply said, "We weren't building engines anymore. We were building consequences." And that's what the 421 Super Duty became. A consequence of pushing too far, too fast, too soon for corporate America to handle. In the decades that followed, muscle car culture would explode again with the GTO, the Camaro, the Challenger wars. But the raw, experimental edge of the early Super Duty era never truly returned. emissions laws tightened. The Clean Air Act of 1970 changed compression ratios forever. Insurance premiums skyrocketed for high-performance vehicles. And by the time the 1970s oil crisis hit, engines like the SD421 were already relics of a wilder time. Compression dropped from 11-to-1 to 8-to-1 almost overnight. Horsepower ratings collapsed. Cars that once made 400 horsepower were now making 200 if they were lucky. And they were heavier, slower, softer. The edge was gone. Today, surviving Pontiac 421 Super Duty engines are collector gold. Rare, almost mythological. Restorers treat them like historical artifacts rather than mechanical components. Finding original parts is nearly impossible. Reproduction components exist, but they're expensive and often not quite right. Original cranks, if you can find them, sell for thousands of dollars. An original Super Duty block in good condition can command 5 figures from the right buyer, because they represent something modern engines rarely dare to be: unfiltered, unrestricted, and unapologetically powerful. So why did GM try to hide it? Because the 421 Super Duty wasn't just fast. It proved what happened when engineers stopped asking for permission. And once you've seen that kind of power unleashed, you don't forget it. That engine didn't just shape Pontiac's racing legacy. It exposed the line between innovation and control, and showed how thin that line really was. It proved that sometimes the most important engineering happens in the shadows. Not because it's illegal, not because it's wrong, but because it's too far ahead of what the world is ready to accept. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you want next. Another hidden engine, a forgotten rivalry, or a machine that was too powerful for its own era. And make sure to subscribe, because the next story might be the one they tried to bury even deeper than this one.